Welcome to the first episode of the Word on Fire show. This is a brand new podcast that we're putting on at Word on Fire. I'm Brandon Vogt, the content director at Word on Fire. And with me is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Brandon, great to be with you.
We're really excited about this new format. We've branched out into just about every other form of media. We've got our online YouTube videos. We have our weekly homilies online. We, of course, have all the written articles. But the one format we really haven't breaking into yet is the podcast. Podcasts have exploded in popularity in recent years. They're a way that people can absorb content on the go whenever they want, wherever they want, whether you're in the car, you're at work, you're mowing the lawn. So we wanted to kind of fill the gap and break into that world of podcasting. So this is our first crack at it. We'll see how it goes. Today we wanted to talk about this extraordinary visit Pope Francis had to America. Bishop Barron was there on the ground in all the major cities, Washington, D.C., New York, and Philadelphia, covering the Pope's visit for NBC. He's written a couple of articles at wordonfire.org. Today we wanted to focus especially on Pope Francis's address to Congress, and in particular, he mentioned four key figures during that talk, which he held up as ideal representatives of the dreams of America. So we're going to talk in depth about each of those four, but real quickly, the first one he mentioned was Martin Luther King Jr., and the second was Abraham Lincoln. Those two probably aren't surprising for most of us, but then he also mentioned Dorothy Day and Thomas Merton, the contemplative Trappist. So Bishop Barron, I know these figures are of great importance to you. You've written and spoken about each of them quite extensively over the years, but let's go through maybe some of the ideas that they hold out, not only to America, but their significance for Catholics. So why don't we start with Martin Luther King Jr. What does he mean to you, and what's his legacy for us today?
You know, I think of King on the steps of Lincoln's Memorial in 1963 in the famous I Have a Dream speech. Not only was it a great act of eloquence, but it was showing how religious people can enter the public sphere precisely as religious. King gave not a sermon that day. It was a political speech, but nevertheless, he brought to bear all sorts of ideas, concepts, language from the biblical tradition. And there he was in our national capital on the steps of Lincoln Memorial, but he talked about divine providence, about God's will, about justice and injustice. He talked about God's purpose vis-a-vis America. I think we've sort of forgotten how to do that. You know, we've interpreted the church-state separation really as a kind of divorce, that religious people, qua religious, cannot get in the public arena. And King proves decisively otherwise. And I think that's a huge value in what he did. The thing about King, now speaking as a Catholic, I'm always moved when I read the letter from the Birmingham City Jail. You know, when King was literally in jail in Birmingham, Alabama, writes his letter. And he wrote it to fellow preachers, many of whom had said to him, hey, you're going too fast, you know. You're pressing the country too much. Back off. And we're with you, but back off. And King refers explicitly to Thomas Aquinas in that letter. Thomas, who said that every positive law should be grounded in the moral law, which in turn is grounded in the eternal law of the mind of God. And therefore an unjust law is not only immoral, it's also an affront to God. An unjust law is no real law. And he says he gets this from Thomas Aquinas. That's another example of how to bring the religious tradition right into the heart of our political arena, and not aggressively, you know, not in a sort of proselytizing spirit, but in a way that's very creative. And I think we've forgotten how to do that, or we've gotten hamstrung on that issue. And I think King is a really, really good example of someone who very deftly entered the public arena precisely as religious, without abandoning religious values and without becoming overbearing or proselytizing. So that's what I find really deeply appealing about King, and where he's a prophetic figure for our time.
I found it interesting that of the four figures that Pope Francis mentioned, of course, Lincoln was involved in the Civil War, but the other three were quite renowned for their stance on nonviolence. Talk a little bit about Martin Luther King's use of nonviolence to bring about these forms of justice.
Yeah, it's a great theme, and one that I think we've not talked about enough. It's too easy to write nonviolence off as this kind of, fringy point of view. But let's face it, it's right at the very heart of Jesus' gospel. In fact, you could argue, some have, that enemy love is the decisive difference when it comes to Christian ethics. A particularly Christian approach to morality is grounded in the love of enemies. I think some of the great practitioners of nonviolence, including King, Gandhi as well, John Paul II in Poland in the 1970s and 80s, show that it's not just this kind of wild, fringy, idealistic conviction, but that nonviolence, properly employed, has a cataclysmic social impact. When people know how to use it, and they can channel the power of it. So I think that's where someone like King, Dorothy Day, Merton, you're right, had strong feelings about it. Although Merton always said, I'm not a pacifist in the strict sense. But yet he thought we had underplayed dramatically the effectiveness of nonviolence. And I really do think John Paul maybe is the very best example in the last, 25, 30 years of how to use it. He effectively brings down one of the most powerful empires in human history. I've often said, I was a kid in the 1970s when the height of the Cold War and, Nixon, Brezhnev, and America, Soviet, and there was always a fear of nuclear war. If you had told us at that point that the Soviet Empire would collapse and there wouldn't be a war involved and that the Pope would be a major player, come on. I mean, nobody would have believed it. And that's what happened. And it's because John Paul knew how to use nonviolence in a very creative way. My own view, and I've said this publicly, like Merton, I mean, I'm not a pacifist. I think that can be too ideological a position. I think there are times in our fallen conflictual world that the only response we can muster in justice to great evil is force. I mean, so I get it. The church's just war tradition, all that, I subscribe to. However, I do think we grossly underplay the power and effectiveness of the nonviolent approach, which is, all these great figures, Day and Merton and Gandhi and King and others have pointed out, is not passivity. It's not running away and, burying your head in the sand. It's a very creative engagement of evil, not using the weapons of the world, but these spiritual weapons, which are far more powerful. So, yeah, I agree with you. I think that it's a very important theme and one that we don't emphasize enough.
Let's switch gears now to the second figure that Pope Francis looked at, Abraham Lincoln. He mentioned him in a speech to Congress, and when he mentioned each of these four figures, he identifies a key trait that they sort of symbolize, that they represent. For Lincoln, it was liberty. That's what Pope Francis associated with him. Also, when he gave his speech at Independence Hall, he delivered it from the same lectern that Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. So there was clearly some intentional connection here to Lincoln. Why do you think Pope Francis lifted him up as a symbol of what we should become as Americans?
Yeah, and of course, I've loved Lincoln since I was about 7 years old. I got a biography of Lincoln when I was a kid, and I've loved his story ever since then. I probably read 25 biographies of Lincoln. Most recently a year ago. So whenever a new one comes out, I usually read it. He's a beguiling figure. There's something saintly about Lincoln, and I don't want to over dramatize it, but that comes through in almost all the biographies, and that his contemporaries saw it. There was something that was just so deeply decent about Lincoln. So there's that. But what I find really interesting, especially to the end of his life, because for much of his adult life, Lincoln was kind of skeptical of organized religion. That seems pretty clear. I think he was religious, but skeptical of the standard denominational offerings, of his time. But as he got older, especially when he became president, moved through the Civil War, I think his spirituality deepened enormously, and it became a very powerful awareness of divine providence, I would say. That history is in the hands of a power greater than than the forces that we unleash. And here's, at the time, mid-19th century, one of the most powerful people on the planet was Abraham Lincoln. I mean, he's guiding these massive armies. In many ways, I mean, America's military power in some ways begins in the Civil War, that we emerge as this great military force. So here's Lincoln, a very powerful figure, but he was keenly aware that ultimately it's in the hands of God. Now read the second inaugural, which Lincoln delivers just weeks before his death. Compare it to King there, because there's Lincoln giving not a sermon, but an inaugural address on the steps of the Capitol, but yet it's redolent of the prophets and filled with biblical language and biblical sensibility and a keen awareness that God has something to do with this great civil war. I think our time, which is so characterized now by secularism, has a lot to learn from Lincoln's perspective. You know, and his liberty, as the Pope points out, and obviously the freeing of the slaves and all that, what's that born of but a very, very deep moral sensibility, which Lincoln had as a young man. I mean, when he first saw slaves being sold and traded, it so deeply offended him. And that stayed true all his life long. Now, he was a canny, prudent politico, too, and he was not an abolitionist, and he felt that was an imprudent approach to it. But, you know, then once the Civil War had happened, I mean, then you know, in some ways it was the worst-case scenario had already happened, so now let's certainly press the issue. But it was born of a very deep moral sensibility and an ever-growing awareness of God's involvement in life. And see, that's what we need today in our political life. See, we're always privatizing it now. So the pro-religion position today is one, oh, I think that's great. You know, I'll tolerate your little private practice of your religion. Lincoln, King, that's not a private practice of religion. That's a very bold assertion of it on the public stage. And I think, to me, that's what's so important about those two figures.
The third figure that Pope Francis alluded to was Dorothy Day. Now, you and I both share a huge affection for Dorothy. She was a 20th century activist Catholic in New York, probably best remembered for founding the Catholic Worker Movement, which is a newspaper and a series of houses and communities throughout the country. She co-founded that with Peter Morin. But she's also sort of a controversial figure in just about any Catholic subgroup you have. She's disliked for various reasons by people all across the religious and political spectrum. And so I found it very intriguing that Pope Francis would focus in on her. To me, she symbolizes, much like Pope Francis does, this bridge, this both and Catholicism that brings together all that's great about every sphere and angle of the Catholic life. In his speech, Pope Francis assigned her the traits of social justice and rights and responsibilities, two great themes in Catholic social teaching. Talk a little bit about what Dorothy Day has meant to you and why you think she's a figure worth holding up for Catholics.
Yeah, you're right. Of course, you're one of the great experts now on Dorothy Day, and the research you've done on her has been very good and bringing her to a new, I think, generation of readers, so I appreciate that. What I love about Dorothy Day, many things, but one is the way she brings together this intense devotion to the poor and to the issues of righting social wrong, and her deep, deep personal piety and spirituality. That the first was born very much of the second. You know, that her immersion in Christ is the ground for her social activism. And again, since Vatican II, I mean, one of the really negative things has been the wedge we've driven between those two things. Left and right have split largely along those lines. Right-wing people today, we say, are more into, you know, personal piety and prayer and the Mass and benediction and retreats. And then left-wing people are into social justice. And, of course, Dorothy Day would have seen them as absolutely mutually implicative and would have bemoaned the divorce of the two. I love that story. I don't know if it's in your book, the story about the priest that came to say Mass for the Catholic workers and thought he was being very hip and very cool and used a coffee cup for the chalice, you know. And so she, you know, piously went through the Mass and everything. But then the minute the Mass was over, She said, well, give me that cup. And then she broke it and she buried it. Because, well, how could that possibly ever be used now as a coffee mug, you know? And it just showed that she wasn't indifferent to the liturgy and to the real presence and the power of the Eucharist, but she saw that as absolutely essential to the work she was doing on the streets. So I love that about her. You know, my good friend George Weigel wouldn't agree with Dorothy Day when it comes to, let's say, reading of American capitalism, wouldn't agree about the way she assessed a lot of situations. And I would say, fair enough. I mean, I think Catholics of goodwill can disagree about means. They don't disagree about ends. They shouldn't anyway. That we have this radical commitment to the poor. We have a radical commitment to right social wrongs. We want to put an end to violence. I mean, all those should remain for everybody. And for everyone, it's born of the same thing, of prayer, Eucharist, saints, sacraments. Now, how precisely you do all that, I think people of goodwill can and do disagree. Fine. Let's have a good debate about it. I think Dorothy Day would have loved to sit down with George Weigel and talk it through, you know, have a good argument. Just as, you know, there are Catholics today who would sit down with Pope Francis maybe and say, hey, let's talk about capitalism. Are you being too negative and so on? Fine. I think that's a great conversation to have. And we shouldn't exclude anyone from that conversation. What I think both Dorothy Day and Pope Francis are really good at showing us are the ends, you know, that if you are a committed Catholic, you're a sacramental person, you're in touch with the means of grace, well, of course you're interested in even a radical commitment to right social wrongs. Great, good. We all agree on that. Now, when it comes to means, fine, let's have a debate about it. And I think that we're certainly a big enough tent to include both, you know, George Weigel and Dorothy Day.
When you were the rector at Mundelein, I remember visiting the campus early on in the semester. So I think the seminarians had just come back. And every year there's a rector's address where you kind of set the tone or you give maybe a central theme to focus on. And around the campus, there's always little posters or reminders of whatever that theme is. And this year, the theme was centered around the spiritual and corporal works of mercy. And around the campus, wherever you turned, any hallway, there'd be a poster quoting Dorothy Day saying, everything a baptized person does every day should be somehow connected to the spiritual or corporal works of mercy. What does that mean?
Yeah. I've always loved that line because it's very concrete. She, I think, had a allergy to the rendering abstract of peace and justice. You know, I'm for peace and justice. Well, everyone from Karl Marx to George Weigel, I mean, is for peace and justice. But what are you talking about? I mean, how? What kind of peace? What kind of justice are you talking about? And she wanted to be very concrete. What Catholics are for are the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. And it was very interesting about Dorothy Day, and this again confounds the usual left-right stuff, because she wasn't a fan of the New Deal. She's operative right during the Roosevelt period, and you think, well, no, Dorothy Day, you know, hard left, She wasn't, because she felt that the New Deal, Roosevelt's programs, took responsibility away from individual people and brought it to the level of the government. Dorothy Day wanted you to feed the hungry. Don't pawn it off on the government. She wanted you, particularly, to give drink to the thirsty. You should do something to clothe the naked. You should visit the imprisoned, etc. And that's really powerful, I think, is we can tend to say, oh, yeah, social justice, that's the work of the government. So I'll try to vote for the right people, or I'll try to, I pay taxes, and fine. But she wants you to say, no, who's hungry right now in my life whom I can do something about? So I think that's a really interesting part of her program. But it's the way she concretized the concern for peace and justice. I mean, I grew up with that language of peace and justice. Fine, who's against peace and justice? But, to paraphrase Alistair McIntyre, I mean, whose peace and what justice? Well, that's what it looks like for Catholics, I like the specificity of it.
It's probably a good time here to point out that the four figures that Pope Francis focused on, Lincoln is remembered as sort of a paragon of virtue, Honest Abe. The other three are pretty deeply flawed, both before and after their conversion. So I'm thinking here of Martin Luther King's well-known infidelities. Dorothy Day had an abortion before her conversion and was remembered as sort of an edgy woman even after it. And then, of course, Thomas Merton lived a pretty wild secular life before he found God. What does it mean to you that Pope Francis would bring these particular figures up as heroes of the faith?
Yeah, that's a good question, and I think you're really right in seeing it that way. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good thing, isn't it? That you're pointing out elements in all these people that are wonderful and are rich. You're not saying that they're flawless. You're not saying that they're morally perfect. And you make the right distinctions in some cases between, pre-conversion, post-conversion. But even as you suggest in the case of Merton, at the end of his life there was this, somewhat ambiguous relationship with the young nurse, et cetera. All right. I mean, I don't think Thomas Merton was a flawless, moral athlete. But he brought something. He opened a window. He opened a door that was very important. And it's interesting. I think you're probably right in suggesting that of all four of them, maybe it's Abe Lincoln that you'd say, well, here's someone with the most consistently, upright moral life. Perhaps that's true. But I think it's the fact that each one of them opened a window in a certain way, and that's worth looking at. And I always, as someone who really has a great affection for Merton and what he meant for me, I've always balked at, because he had flaws, we should pay no attention to him. That's just crazy. That's crazy and unhelpful. Unless he's a flawless saint, he's not a spiritual master. Well, I don't know. I mean, look at Saint Augustine. So I think that can be a dead end. If we start going down that road that you've got to check that you're morally perfect in every way, we're not going to have any spiritual masters except Jesus and his mother. So. I think that's what you're suggesting is really right, and it's good that nevertheless we draw attention to people that have opened a door in some ways for us.
Now let's turn to the fourth and final figure Pope Francis highlighted, and I want to spend more time on him, and it's Thomas Merton. I know Merton has had an enormous influence not only on your life but on your priesthood. We're sitting here underneath the picture of Thomas Merton, as chance would have it. Talk a little bit about first Merton. Who was he? Why does he matter? And then maybe we can get into this very intriguing association Pope Francis gave Thomas Merton's openness to God. That's the value that he contributes to American life. So first, who was Thomas Merton? Why does he matter? How did he influence you?
Yeah, Thomas Merton was really one of the most intriguing, I think, Catholic figures in the 20th century, and he was part of that wonderful revival that happened mid-20th century, including figures, like Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh and like Fulton Sheen and like Dorothy Day and many others. There was a revival of Catholic life mid-20th century, and Merton was one of the major players there. He was the son of a New Zealand father and an American mother that met over in France. He was born in France during World War I. In fact, we're having the 100th anniversary. He was born in 1915. Merton, his mother died very young, and then he and his father kind of wandered around. His father was a kind of a bohemian, more vagabondish kind of artist type. Then his father died when Merton was only 16, so he was orphaned pretty young. Very bright young man, spoke French fluently, of course learned English, and was very involved in the artistic literary life of the 1930s and so on. Ends up eventually in Columbia in New York and falls in with a very interesting crowd of fellow students and also professors. So a very sort of plugged in, intellectually alert, artistically sensitive young guy, but feeling this very deep emptiness at the heart of his life. Until, as I mentioned, when I was there in New York, we were covering the speech for the Today Show. It was, of course, in D.C., but I was in New York covering it. And I said to them, to Matt Lauer and to Brian Williams, I said, it was right down the street from where we are. We were at 30 Rock, which is right near St. Patrick's. I said, right down Fifth Avenue. Young Thomas Merton, this kind of, cool cat, worldling sort of guy, culturally plugged in, stumbles on this book by Etienne Gilson, the great Thomist philosopher, called The Spirit of Medieval Philosophy. And in that book, he comes upon, for the first time, an intellectually serious account of God. And like a lot of, bohemian intellectuals of the time, he thought religion was this, old medieval thing that we've sloughed off, and no person takes it seriously. And he discovered this extremely rich tradition, and that got him going. That was the door that opened up, and Merton went through it with great enthusiasm. And to make a long story short, read The Seven-Storey Mountain for the details, his great autobiography. But it leads him eventually toward becoming a Catholic and then becoming a Trappist monk, someone that wanted to give his life utterly to God. See, and that's what I think is so important. The Pope highlighted, his dialogic approach and openness to other religions, and all that's true, and that's part of Merton's thing. But I think what's most important is he's someone in the middle of the 20th century who dramatically opened a window onto God, because he discovered God as a young man, and it revolutionized his whole life. And I think he intuited something that Flannery O'Connor, by the way, another member of that mid-20th century revival, she intuited that what was coming was the secularized society. It wasn't quite there yet. Go back to 1950, vast majority of Americans would have been religious, would have bought the basic biblical narrative, etc. But I think these people intuited something that was coming, namely this secularist worldview that God is just sort of forgotten about, and what Charles Taylor calls the buffered self, the self that just is buffered from any contact with the transcendent. Thomas Merton, in writing about contemplation, which is clearly his central theme, social justice issues, world religions, all that, yes, but the central theme clearly is contemplation. What is that? But opening your eyes and seeing God, opening your ears and listening to God. God matters ultimately and finally. And I think that's what Merton brings to our time. And see, I would say without that, the whole thing falls apart. All the talk about mercy and inclusivity and reaching out to the marginalized. I mean, who cares? If there's no God, who cares? So I think that's why Merton continues to be a very important figure. Is he a flawed character? Yes, no question about it. But did he write more eloquently than almost anybody else in the 20th century on the issue of God? I think you'd be hard-pressed to find someone who's more effective at opening that particular window. He did it for me. I was 16 when I first stumbled on the Seven-Storey Mountain, and it revolutionized my life. That's no exaggeration. And in many ways, I'm a priest because of him. I always say the two Thomases, Aquinas and Merton, had the biggest impact on me as a kid. One, you might say, appealing much more to the mind. Merton, to oversimplify, appealing to the heart. But Merton was also super smart, in command of many languages. I mean, read everything. I've often said he opened for me the door to so many spiritual and intellectual figures, from the Little Flower to Hans Urs von Balthasar to Bernard of Clairvaux to Teresa of Avila to John of the Cross. I first learned about those people from Merton, And I think a lot of people in my generation, that's true. That if we learn that tradition, Merton was the one that kicked open the door. So for all those reasons, I think he's still a massively important figure. And I hope there's a bit of a revival, because having now taught in the seminary for a long time, I know that if and when Merton's name would come up, like in the last maybe 20 years, the younger guys now would tend to either not know him, or if they did, they'd sort of write him off. My generation and prior, so go back to like into the 50s, 60s, 70s, Merton was the bomb. I mean, Merton was the one that we often turned to. So I'm happy to see there's a bit of a Merton revival going on. And maybe the Pope's speech will, in fact, hasn't it? Didn't we say, or you discovered that?
Yeah, we were looking at the Amazon sales rankings, both for Merton's autobiography and Dorothy Day's, and both of them leapt into the top 100 books on all of Amazon within an hour of the Pope's speech.
But all of Amazon.
Right.
No, and I would say to anyone listening, read The Seven-Storey Mountain. Start with that. And I still think, and it's not fashionable to say in Merton circles, it's still his best book. I reverence a lot of his other books, but that's still his best book. Some will say, oh, that's Preconciliar and Merton. Come on. It's still his best book. And it's a spiritual classic. Fulton Sheen himself said it's the Augustine's Confessions for our time. Evelyn Waugh deeply admired its literary quality, all this. But it's still a wonderful romantic story of a guy falling in love with God and what that feels like and looks like and sounds like, and told by a really gifted writer. So start with that book, I'd say.
I want to ask one more question about Merton. If there was a buffer to God in Merton's day, that's only increased in ours. I'm thinking of people in my generation, their 20s and 30s, who are, for the most part, absolutely indifferent toward God and spiritual things. Most of them aren't going to stumble across a Scrivener's bookstore and pick up a copy of scholastic theology. So how would somebody like Merton help people to open the window to God today, people who are deeply entrenched in the secular worldview?
Well, he might just tease them into it by the sheer radicality of his life. So becoming a Trappist monk, which means someone who will enter into the most sort of primitive form of the Benedictine life, accepting a lot of silence. So your life becomes absolutely focused on prayer. The very radicality of that, I think, might get people's attention. Like, how could someone actually live that way? Here's a guy who was a successful player in the worldly sense. I mean, he was popular, and he was beginning a career as a writer, and he's in New York, and that guy gave all that up and became a Trappist monk. I think that just will trigger something maybe in people's hearts. And then just the way he talks about prayer, what prayer is. Not just muttering words in the back of a church, but that prayer becomes a whole attitude and way of life. I hope that would impact people, but it's more the witness of his life, I think. And Merton had a wonderful kind of open spirit. Something he and I share is a love for Bob Dylan. He loved Bob Dylan, and one of my favorite images. And I got this. I read about it, but then got it directly from Merton's secretary, Patrick Hart, who's still alive, and he confirmed that when Jacques Maritain, the great Thomist philosopher, as an old man, came to Gethsemane about 1966, and there he is, wrapped up in his shawl, and Merton took him outside, and they had one of those little phonographs, and he's playing Bob Dylan's latest record and translating it into French for Jacques Maritain. And by most accounts, Jacques wasn't too taken by Bob Dylan, but Merton loved him. Merton got it, and he got there is, because I've argued probably ad nauseum, there's a spirituality in Bob Dylan that Merton got. But I've always loved that about him. It's a sort of openness of spirit, toward different cultural expressions and the different religions and all that. On that point too, but Merton never lost his Catholic center. It's absolutely a calumny to suggest that Merton became a sort of, hippy-dippy, anything goes, I'm beyond Christianity. Never, never, never. Merton never lost his Catholic center as he reached out to other, religions. Anyway, all that to me makes him, still an attractive figure.
Let's close this segment here on these four figures that Pope Francis mentioned: Martin Luther King Jr., Abraham Lincoln, Dorothy Day, Thomas Merton. I know a lot of people who want to learn more about these are wondering, what books would you recommend? You mentioned Seven Storey Mountain for Merton. What are maybe one or two other books you'd recommend on each of the four figures?
Dorothy Day, certainly The Long Loneliness, her great spiritual autobiography, which is a wonderful book, and it's beautifully written. It's a heartbreaking book in some ways. It's a heart-wrenching book, I find. The Long Loneliness. Also, they'll get her letters, and diaries that have come out in more recent years. I think are very telling. For Lincoln, obviously the great speeches of Lincoln, and go back to the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and go back to those great speeches on slavery he gave in the 50s of the 19th century. For biographies of Lincoln, the Carl Sandburg biography is still a classic to read. It's a long thing to plow through. A guy named I'm blanking now. David. I can't think of it now. This is about 5 years ago. One of the really great Lincoln scholars wrote a very fine biography of Lincoln. I think I referenced it the other day. Where was I? I referenced it. The Spielberg movie about Lincoln, I think, is very fine. And, of course, that's based on Doris Kearns Goodwin's book on the Team of Rivals, which I think is also very fine on Lincoln. King, I've got a great collection, this must be up here on the shelf somewhere, of King speeches. And those are great. It's a big fat thing, about 500 pages.
That's A Testament to Hope.
That's it, yeah, that's it. Plow through that. That's really worth reading. And there have been a number of good biographies of King in recent years, but I'd start with the speeches of King. Just go through those.
Thanks so much for listening to this first episode of the Word on Fire show. We're really excited about this. We're planning to post a new episode of the show every single week. So to make sure you don't miss any of the future shows, subscribe to the Word on Fire show using either iTunes or your favorite podcast app. And also be sure to visit the website, wordonfireshow.com. Thanks so much, and we'll see you in episode 2.